Welcome to the American Valor World War II channel. Subscribe to our channel because every day we publish stories about the valor of American soldiers based on real events. Support us. Like our videos if you like what we do for you. March 7th, 1945, 3:15 p.m. Remagen, Germany. The steel of the Ludendorff Bridge hummed with tension as American artillery shells exploded nearby, each impact sending tremors through the massive structure spanning the Rhine River. Inside the dark tunnel beneath Erpeler lay, the towering 600-foot cliff on the east bank. Captain Willy Bratke's hands trembled as he scrawled his signature on the demolition order. The paper itself seemed to resist, as if knowing the fate it was sealing. "Make it fast, Friesenhahn," Bratke whispered to the 50-year-old engineer beside him. "The Americans are at the edge of town." Captain Karl Friesenhahn's weathered face betrayed no emotion as he took the paper, but his voice cracked slightly. "I requested 600 kilograms of military-grade explosives. They sent me 300 kilograms of Donnerit, mining explosives. This might not be enough." Outside, the steady rhythm of American tank treads grinding over cobblestone streets grew louder. The sound of boots, hundreds of them, echoed through the medieval town of Remagen. For nearly 2 millennia, this quiet settlement had watched armies come and go. The Romans, Napoleon, and now the Americans, intent on crossing the Rhine and penetrating into the heart of Hitler's Germany. Friesenhahn gazed at the bridge that had become his responsibility, a responsibility that would determine the fate of thousands, perhaps millions. The 1,069-foot steel and stone colossus had stood since World War I, a testament to German engineering. Its 4 massive stone piers supported 3 metal spans across the churning waters of the Rhine. In the distance, 27-year-old Sergeant Alexander Drabik of the U.S. 9th Armored Division crouched behind a stone wall, his eyes fixed on the bridge. The son of Polish immigrants, a butcher from Toledo, Ohio, had no idea that in 15 minutes he would make history, or that his life would be forever bound to this bridge. As American forces closed in, an eerie silence fell over the scene. The artillery stopped. The machine guns went quiet. Even the Rhine itself seemed to still its eternal flow, as if holding its breath for what would come next. What happened in the next hour would send ripples through history that continue to this day. 33 Americans would eventually lose their lives because of this bridge. 5 German officers would be executed by firing squad on Hitler's direct orders. And the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history would be altered forever. This is the true story of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, a tale of courage, failure, death, and the relentless forces of war that sometimes transcend human understanding, creating horrors that no fiction could match. December 14, 1916, Remagen, Germany. The first rivet driven into the Ludendorff Bridge contained, according to local lore, a drop of blood from a Russian prisoner of war. Whether by accident or dark ritual, no records confirm how the blood came to stain the metal. But the old bridge master, Otto Weiss, would later tell U.S. Army historian Ken Heckler that he had seen it with his own eyes, a crimson stain on the cold iron that never seemed to fully rust away. The bridge was the brainchild of German General Erich Ludendorff, a key military strategist in World War I. Ludendorff envisioned a critical railway link that would allow rapid movement of troops and supplies to the Western Front. Construction began in 1916, using the forced labor of Russian prisoners of war. Many died during its construction, from exhaustion, malnutrition, or accidents that were rarely documented. "The prisoners worked until they dropped," recounted Johannes Weber, a Remagen resident who witnessed the construction as a young boy. "When they fell, they were dragged away. New men took their place. No one ever asked about the ones who disappeared." The bridge was completed in 1919, too late to influence the war for which it was intended, but it stood as a monument to German military engineering, a stone and steel behemoth that dominated the picturesque Rhine Valley. 4 massive towers, resembling medieval castles, guarded its approaches. These towers, with their slit windows, were designed for machine gun emplacements, transforming the bridge into a defensive stronghold. The Ludendorff Bridge connected the village of Remagen on the west bank with the tiny hamlet of Erpel on the east. On the eastern side, The railway tracks disappeared into a 1,200-foot tunnel bored directly into Erpeler, the towering cliff that overlooks the Rhine at this point. In the years between the wars, the bridge served as a vital commercial link. But local residents never fully embraced it. "It always felt cold," said Maria Brücken, a lifelong Remagen resident interviewed after the war. "Even on the hottest summer days, there was a chill when you walked across. Some said it was the wind through the girders. Others said it was the ghosts of the Russians who died building it." By 1945, the bridge had gained a sinister reputation among local children who dared each other to run across it after dark. Few accepted the challenge, and those who did reported hearing whispers in Russian coming from the metal supports. The bridge's massive construction made it a survivor. It withstood dozens of Allied bombing raids during World War II. On October 9, 1944, a raid by 33 bombers damaged it, and it was reported as destroyed. Yet a month later, German engineers had it operational again. When American bombers struck again on December 28, 1944, hitting it with 4 bombs, the bridge trembled but remained standing. The 446th Bombardment Group attacked for 4 consecutive days from December 28 to 31, 1944. Yet each time, German repair crews worked feverishly to keep the bridge functional. More bombing raids in January and February 1945 failed to destroy the seemingly indestructible structure. On March 5, 1945, just 2 days before its fateful capture, B-24 bombers from the 491st Bombardment Group made one final attempt to destroy the bridge, and failed. "It was as if the bridge refused to die," said Lieutenant Colonel Milton Kahn of the 491st Bombardment Group. "I've seen much smaller bridges collapse with a single direct hit. This one took everything we threw at it and remained standing." The Ludendorff Bridge's resilience would soon become a pivotal factor in the closing chapter of World War II, a chapter written in the blood of those who sought to destroy it, those who tried to save it, and those caught in between. February 28, 1945, Berlin, Germany. Adolf Hitler's hands shook with barely controlled rage as he stabbed his finger at the large map spread across the oak table. His face, bloated and pale from years spent in underground bunkers, contorted as spittle collected at the corners of his mouth. "Every bridge on the Rhine is to be prepared for demolition," he shouted. "But no bridge, I repeat, no bridge, is to be blown prematurely." The Führer's order came in response to a catastrophic incident at the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne. An Allied bombing raid had accidentally detonated the explosives German engineers had pre-positioned on the bridge, destroying it before retreating German forces could cross. Hitler was furious at the loss. The resulting directive, documented in Wehrmacht orders dated March 1, 1945, was contradictory and placed impossible demands on field commanders. 1. Demolition charges were to be stored near bridges, not placed on them, until American forces were within 5 miles. 2. Igniters were to be attached only at the last possible moment. 3. Both the preparation order and the demolition order must be issued in writing by the officer bearing tactical responsibility. 4. Any officer who destroyed a bridge prematurely or allowed one to fall into enemy hands intact would face court-martial and possible execution. These contradictory orders would soon create a deadly dilemma for the defenders of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. It was a death sentence either way. Captain Karl Friesenhahn would later tell American interrogators, "Blow the bridge too soon, face the firing squad. Let it fall to the enemy, face the firing squad." And with constantly changing commands and inadequate supplies, it was impossible to properly prepare for either scenario. Major Hans Scheller, who would become the bridge's final commander, confided in a letter to his pregnant wife Liesel on March 5th. "The orders make no sense. They want us to hold until the last moment, yet be ready to destroy instantly. They give us old men and boys to defend a critical crossing and not enough explosives to properly rig it for demolition. I fear what's coming." He had reason to fear. Within a week, Scheller would be dead, executed by firing squad on Hitler's orders. His wife would give birth to their child 3 months later, never seeing her husband again. As the Allied forces approached the Rhine in early March 1945, the German High Command was in disarray. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander-in-chief of the German armies in the West, knew the war was lost but continued to execute Hitler's increasingly irrational orders. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, was tasked with defending the Rhine. A dedicated Nazi and skilled tactician known as Hitler's fireman for his ability to shore up crumbling fronts. Even Model could not rectify the impossible situation. The defense of the Remagen Bridge fell under the 67th Corps, commanded by General Otto Hitzfeld. But the real responsibility lay with the men on the ground. Men who would soon find themselves caught between Hitler's impossible orders and the advancing American army. March 6, 1945, Remagen, Germany. Captain Willy Bratge peered through his binoculars from the western tower of the Ludendorff Bridge. At 40 years old, the decorated combat veteran had been deemed unfit for frontline service after sustaining multiple wounds on the Eastern Front. Now, as the nominal commander of the Remagen defensive sector, he commanded a patchwork force of invalids, old men, and boys. "Anything?" asked Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the 50-year-old engineer responsible for the bridge's demolition. A veteran of World War I who had been wounded 3 times, Friesenhahn had been recalled to service and given command of an engineering company of similarly aged reservists. "American reconnaissance aircraft," Bratge replied. "They're getting closer." The two captains had a cordial but strained relationship. Though Bratge was technically in command of the Remagen area, his authority over the various units was limited. Friesenhahn's engineers answered to their own chain of command. The anti-aircraft batteries on Erpeler Lay belonged to the Luftwaffe and had their own commanders. The Hitler Youth and Volkssturm, civilian militia, units reported to Nazi Party officials. This fractured command structure would prove fatal in the hours to come. "Have you received the explosives you requested?" Bratge asked. Friesenhahn's weather-beaten face tightened. "I requested 600 kilograms of military-grade explosives. They sent half that amount, 300 kilograms of industrial Donnerit, mining explosives, less powerful." "Will it be enough?" Friesenhahn hesitated. "It should damage the bridge enough to make it unusable. But a complete collapse, I can't guarantee that." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a dusty staff car. From it emerged Major Hans Scheller, the adjutant of 67 Corps Commander General Hitzfeld. "Captain Bratge," Scheller announced formally. "Effective immediately, I am assuming command of the Remagen Bridge defense by order of General Hitzfeld." This sudden transfer of authority, not properly communicated to Bratge until this moment, added another layer of confusion to the already chaotic situation. Scheller's arrival also complicated the chain of command for demolition. According to Hitler's orders, only the area commander could give written authorization to prepare and detonate the explosives. That authority had just transferred from Bratge to Scheller, a man who had arrived mere hours before the Americans. The defenders of the bridge represented a microcosm of the crumbling Third Reich in its final days. Bratge's security company consisted of 36 men, mostly wounded veterans deemed unfit for frontline service. Friesenhahn commanded about 120 elderly engineers from the 3rd Company of Engineer Battalion 12, 180 Hitler Youth, teenage boys with minimal training, an anti-aircraft unit of 200 Luftwaffe personnel, 20 men from Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peter's experimental rocket battery, 120 Osttruppen, Eastern volunteers, former Soviet prisoners who had agreed to fight for Germany to escape the camps. Approximately 500 Volkssturm, civilian militia consisting mainly of old men and young boys. Most had inadequate weapons, little ammunition, and minimal training. Their communications consisted of one military telephone line connecting to the German army line between Bonn and Koblenz, and another connected to military district headquarters in Wiesbaden. Both were unreliable due to bombing damage. As darkness fell on March 6th, the retreating remnants of once proud Wehrmacht units streamed across the bridge. Exhausted men with hollow eyes, many wounded, all defeated. Equipment was abandoned on roadsides as fuel ran out. Vehicles were pushed into the Rhine to prevent their capture. Among the retreating soldiers was Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, whose experimental Flakwerfer 44 rocket battery had been ordered to cross the Rhine. Peters approached Scheller and Bratke with an unusual request. "I need to get my men and equipment across, but it will take time. Can you delay destroying the bridge?" This request, seemingly minor at the time, would later cost Peters his life. When the bridge failed to collapse completely under demolition charges, Hitler's flying special court-martial would find Peters partially responsible for the delay and sentence him to death by firing squad. As night fell, the defenders of the bridge received reports that American forces had broken through German lines and were approaching Remagen. The final hours of the Ludendorff Bridge had begun. March 7, 1945, 7 a.m., near Beiersdorf, Germany, Lieutenant Karl Timmermann of A Company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, Combat Command B, 9th Armored Division, stood shivering in the pre-dawn darkness as he studied his map. At 22 years old, the German-born American citizen from West Point, Nebraska, had been promoted to company commander just the previous day after his predecessor had been wounded. His unit, nicknamed the Phantom Division, had been in Europe since October 1944 and had seen heavy combat during the Battle of the Bulge. Now they were part of Operation Lumberjack, the Allied push to the Rhine. Timmermann's orders were simple. Advance to the Rhine at Remagen. Check if the Ludendorff Bridge was still standing. Intelligence suggested it had been destroyed. And if not, prepare for a future assault crossing of the river. No one, not Timmermann, not his commanders, not even General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, expected to find the bridge intact. Allied planning assumed all Rhine bridges would be destroyed by retreating Germans. Major crossing operations were being prepared further north under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. At 8 a.m., Timmermann gathered his men. Among them was Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a 34-year-old former butcher from Toledo, Ohio. The son of Polish immigrants, Drabik had been wounded during the Battle of the Bulge but had returned to duty. "We're headed for the Rhine," Timmermann told them. "We'll likely find the bridge destroyed. Our job is to secure the western bank and report what we find." As they moved out, none of these men knew they were heading toward a moment that would change history. Meanwhile, a similar briefing was taking place a few miles away. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engemann, commanding a task force of the 14th Tank Battalion, had been given the same objective: advance to Remagen and report on the bridge's status. The American force consisted of 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, -1 company, 14th Tank Battalion, -1 company, a platoon from C Troop, 89th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a platoon of Treadway Bridge Engineers, a platoon from the 9th Armored Engineer Battalion. These units advanced cautiously through the rolling hills west of Remagen, encountering only sporadic resistance from disorganized German rearguards. Most were exhausted Volkssturm militiamen who surrendered after token resistance. By noon, forward elements had reached high ground overlooking Remagen. What they saw stunned them. "My God, the bridge is still up!" exclaimed Captain George Sumas, Timmermann's operations officer, peering through binoculars. Indeed, against all expectations, the massive structure of the Ludendorff Bridge was clearly visible, spanning the Rhine. German troops and vehicles could be seen streaming across it, evacuating from the west to the east bank. This unexpected discovery was immediately reported up the chain of command, reaching Brigadier General William M. Hogue, commander of Combat Command B. "Well, I'll be damned," Hogues muttered, studying the reports. His next decision would be among the most momentous of the war. The standing orders from the First Army commander, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, were to proceed to the Rhine and halt. The main crossing was planned further north, but the unexpected opportunity to seize an intact bridge over the Rhine was too valuable to ignore. Hogue made his decision. "Tell Timmermann to get that bridge if he can. If he can't, blow it up." With those words, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic moments of World War II. March 7, 1945, 1 p.m., Remagen, Germany. The first American tank shells crashed into the outskirts of Remagen at precisely 1:10 p.m. The ancient town, with its Roman foundations and medieval streets, shuddered under the impact. Civilians huddled in cellars as the sound of tank treads grinding over cobblestones grew louder. Inside the eastern entrance to the railroad tunnel beneath Erpeler, Major Hans Scheller's radio crackled with desperate reports. American forces had broken through the meager defenses west of town and were advancing rapidly toward the bridge. "Prepare the bridge for demolition," Scheller ordered Captain Friesenhahn. "But wait for my written order to detonate." Friesenhahn dispatched his engineers onto the bridge to make the final connections. The 300 kilograms of donorite explosives had been positioned at what he hoped were the bridge's most vulnerable points, primarily on the eastern pier. At 1:50 p.m., with American forces already engaged in street fighting on the outskirts of Remagen, Friesenhahn detonated a small charge on the western approach ramp. This preliminary explosion created a 30-foot crater in the roadbed, intended to prevent American tanks from accessing the bridge. It was a delaying tactic at best. American combat engineers would fill such craters in hours. Meanwhile, the flow of retreating German soldiers across the bridge had slowed to a trickle. The last organized unit, elements of the 277th Volksgrenadier Division, had crossed earlier that morning. Now, only stragglers and wounded remained on the west bank. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, whose experimental rocket battery had delayed demolition, was among the last to cross. His secret Flakwerfer 44 weapons, multiple rocket launchers that the German High Command considered vital technology, were safely on the east bank. Peters himself would not be safe for long. Within days, he would face a firing squad for his role in the bridge's capture. On the western edge of Remagen, Lieutenant Timmerman's infantry and Lieutenant Colonel Engelmann's tanks fought their way through increasingly determined resistance. The Germans knew what was at stake: the last bridge standing across the Rhine, Germany's final natural barrier. By 2:30 p.m., American forces had fought their way to the town square. From there, they could see the bridge and the frantic activity of German engineers making final preparations for demolition. "We need to move now," Timmerman told his radioman. "Tell Colonel Engelmann we're going for the bridge." At 3 p.m., American tanks reached positions where they could fire directly at the bridge towers. Machine gun nests in those towers had been raking advancing infantry with deadly fire. The tanks' 75mm guns blasted the ancient stonework, silencing several gun positions. Under this covering fire, Timmerman led his men in a dash toward the bridge. Among them was Sergeant Alexander Drabik, running at the head of his squad. Inside the tunnel on the eastern bank, the drama reached its climax. Major Scheller handed Captain Bratke a signed demolition order. Bratke ran to find Friesenhahn, but in the confusion of shellfire and crumbling defenses, precious minutes were lost. When Bratke finally located Friesenhahn, he demanded immediate detonation. The by-the-book engineer, however, insisted that Bratke provide a written order as well. A perfect example of the fatal German insistence on protocol, even as disaster loomed. Precious minutes ticked by as Bratke scribbled the order. By the time Friesenhahn received the proper documentation, American troops were already on the bridge. At approximately 3:20 p.m., Friesenhahn turned the detonator handle. A hollow click was all that resulted. No explosion. He tried again. Nothing. "The circuit must be broken," he shouted. "We need to trigger it manually." A German corporal named Anton Faust volunteered for the suicidal mission. He dashed from the tunnel onto the bridge under heavy American fire to manually light the primer cord. Against all odds, he reached the charges, lit the fuse, and made it back to the tunnel alive. At 3:50 p.m., a massive explosion shook the bridge. Smoke and debris filled the air. For a moment, it seemed the bridge had been destroyed, but when the smoke cleared, an astonishing sight greeted both sides. The Ludendorff Bridge, though damaged, was still standing. The inadequate explosives had only managed to create a crater in the roadbed and damage the eastern pedestrian walkway. The main structure remained intact. On the western approach, Sergeant Drabik saw his opportunity. Without waiting for orders, he led his squad in a desperate dash across the bridge. We ran down the middle of the bridge, shouting as we went, Drabik later recalled. I didn't stop because I knew that if I kept moving, they couldn't hit me. My men were in squad column, and not one of them was hit. Drabik lost his helmet during the crossing but didn't slow down. At 3:55 p.m., he became the first American soldier to cross the Rhine, reaching the eastern bank with his squad close behind. Lieutenant Timmerman, the first officer to cross, arrived moments later. Inside the tunnel, Major Scheller, Captain Bratka, and Captain Friesenhahn realized the catastrophe that had befallen them. Their defense had failed. The bridge demolition had failed, and they knew what that meant under Hitler's orders. We need to organize a counterattack, Scheller said desperately. But it was too late. American troops had secured both ends of the tunnel. Within hours, all 3 German officers would be prisoners of war. For 2 of them, Friesenhahn and Bratka, this capture would ironically save their lives, as they would avoid the firing squad that awaited Scheller upon his return to German lines. The race for the Ludendorff Bridge was over. Against all odds, the Americans had won. March 7, 1945, 4:30 p.m., Ludendorff Bridge, Remagen. The first American flag raised on the eastern bank of the Rhine fluttered in the cold March wind. Raised by exuberant GIs from the 9th Armored Division, it symbolized an achievement that no Allied commander had thought possible. A bridgehead across the Rhine weeks ahead of schedule. Send everything you've got, came the order from Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commander of the FIRST U.S. Army, when he learned of the bridge's capture. Hold it at all costs. Within hours, a stream of American forces began pouring across the damaged but still standing bridge. Combat engineers worked frantically to repair the cratered roadway and shore up damaged sections. As darkness fell, powerful searchlights were set up on both banks to illuminate the structure and prevent German demolition teams from approaching. For the German High Command, the loss of the bridge was catastrophic. When Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, learned of its capture, he reportedly fell silent for several minutes before ordering immediate counterattacks. I want that bridge destroyed if it costs every plane in the Luftwaffe, Model told his staff. Hitler's reaction was far more volcanic. Upon hearing the news, he flew into one of his characteristic rages, screaming that he had been betrayed by incompetent officers. He immediately ordered the formation of Fliegendes Sonderstandgericht West, Flying Special Court-Martial West, under Major General Rudolf Hübner, a fanatical Nazi with no legal experience. Hübner's orders were simple: find those responsible for losing the bridge and execute them. Meanwhile, the battle for the bridge had continued. German forces, hastily assembled from whatever units were available, launched desperate counterattacks against the expanding American foothold on the eastern bank. Artillery from the heights above Erpel rained down on American positions and the bridge itself. The Luftwaffe made its first major attempt to destroy the bridge on the night of March 7-8. German pilots, many flying their final mission, braved intense anti-aircraft fire and suicidal attacks on the bridge. American gunners created a virtual wall of flak around the structure. The sky looked like it was on fire, recalled Private Joseph Petrensik of the 482nd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Automatic Weapons Battalion. Tracers everywhere, explosions, burning planes falling into the Rhine. I've never seen anything like it. Despite the ferocity of the German air attacks, not a single bomb found its mark. The bridge, which had survived dozens of Allied bombing raids, now seemed equally impervious to German efforts to destroy it. On March 8th, the first deployment of Germany's revolutionary jet aircraft, the Arado AR-234 bomber, failed to hit the bridge. These aircraft, capable of speeds that made them almost impossible for American fighters to intercept, were Germany's last technological hope. By March 9, over 8,000 American troops had crossed the bridge. More crossed on hastily constructed pontoon bridges, built by combat engineers working under constant artillery fire. The sign at the entrance to the bridge summed up the American triumph. Cross the Rhine with dry feet, courtesy of 9th ARMD Division. but the bridge was living on borrowed time. The cumulative damage from the failed demolition, artillery hits, and the stress of thousands of troops and vehicles crossing had weakened its structure. American engineers worked around the clock to reinforce it, knowing that its collapse would be not just a tactical setback, but a psychological blow. On March 10, the bloodletting began on the German side. Major General Rudolf Hübner's flying court-martial arrived near Rimbach, about 60 miles from Remagen. There, in a local restaurant, Hübner set up his court, a tribunal with no defense counsel, no proper procedures, and a single predetermined outcome. The first to be tried was Major Hans Scheller, who had assumed command of the bridge defense just hours before its capture. When offered a copy of the German military legal code, Hübner reportedly waved it aside, stating that the Führer's will is the only law that matters now. After a perfunctory 20-minute trial, Scheller was found guilty of failing to destroy the bridge. He was allowed 45 minutes to write a letter to his pregnant wife before being escorted to a nearby woods. There, on March 11, he was executed with a single shot to the back of the neck. His body, along with the torn-up fragments of his letter, was given a shallow burial where he fell. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, whose rocket battery had delayed the bridge demolition, met the same fate that day. On March 13, Majors Herbert Strobel and August Kraft, who had organized a failed counterattack to retake the bridge, were similarly tried and executed. Their bodies were left in shallow graves near Oberirsen. Captain Willy Bratka was tried in absentia and sentenced to death, but as an American prisoner of war, he escaped execution. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, also a prisoner, was acquitted in absentia, the court finding he had done everything in his power to destroy the bridge. General Richard von Bothmer, commander of the Bonn and Remagen area, chose a different path. When court-martialed for surrendering Bonn without a fight, he grabbed a pistol from a court official and committed suicide in the courtroom. The blood purge extended to the highest levels. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander-in-chief in the West, was dismissed and replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. However, the latter retained Model in operational command of Army Group B, recognizing that his tactical skills were still needed in the desperate situation. As the executions proceeded, the battle for the bridgehead intensified. German artillery pounded the American positions relentlessly. Counterattacks by hastily assembled battle groups tried to push the Americans back to the Rhine. On the bridge itself, American engineers worked under constant fire to strengthen the damaged structure, but the strain was beginning to show. Ominous creaking sounds emanated from the steel superstructure. Cracks appeared in key support members. The battle for the Remagen bridgehead had become a race against time. Could the Americans expand their foothold before the bridge collapsed, or German counterattacks drove them back? The answer would come in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. March 17, 1945, 2:30 p.m. Ludendorff Bridge, Remagen. The day dawned clear and cold, the first break in the weather in over a week. For the engineers of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion and the 1058th Engineer Port Construction and Repair Group working on the Ludendorff Bridge, it was a welcome change from the rain and fog that had hampered their efforts. Approximately 200 American combat engineers were on the bridge that afternoon. For 10 days they had worked around the clock to shore up the damaged structure, while thousands of troops and vehicles continued to cross. Now, with several pontoon bridges in operation nearby, the Ludendorff had been closed for major repairs. Staff Sergeant Eugene Dorland of the 276th Engineers was part of a team working on the eastern span of the bridge. They had been reinforcing damaged girders with steel plates and wooden supports. The whole bridge was humming, Dorland would later recall. You could feel it vibrating under your feet. Some of the men joked about it, but most of us were too busy to worry. At precisely 3 p.m., without warning, a low groaning sound began to emanate from the central span. The vibration in the steel intensified. Several engineers looked up from their work, suddenly alert to the danger. "Get off the bridge," shouted Lieutenant Hugh Mott. "She's going!" But it was already too late. With a deafening roar, the central span of the Ludendorff Bridge broke free from its supports and plunged into the churning waters of the Rhine. The two adjacent spans, suddenly unsupported, twisted and collapsed in turn. Men and equipment disappeared into the river. Some were crushed by falling girders. Others were thrown clear, only to drown in the swift current, weighed down by their equipment. From his observation post on the West Bank, Major General John W. Leonard, commander of the 9th Armored Division, watched in horror as the bridge disintegrated. "My God," he whispered, "my God." The toll was devastating. 28 American engineers died in the collapse or its immediate aftermath. 7 were killed instantly by falling debris. 3 died later from their injuries. 18 were listed as missing, presumed drowned in the Rhine. Additionally, 63 engineers were injured, many seriously. Private Dan Yolo, a 20-year-old Army engineer from Santa Rosa, California, was one of the lucky ones. "I put it in high gear and took off," he later told a war correspondent. "I'm not sure how I made it off. I somehow found myself on the bank by the edge of the water." Yolo helped rescue the injured and recover the bodies of the dead. Among those he assisted was a sergeant he knew well, who seemed physically uninjured, but died shortly afterward, likely from a concussion suffered during the collapse. The recovery effort was hampered by continued German artillery fire. Even as American medics worked to save the injured, shells exploded around them. The Germans, seeing the bridge's destruction as a victory, intensified their bombardment of the area. News of the bridge's collapse was greeted with jubilation in what remained of Nazi Germany. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels hailed it as a sign that God was still on Germany's side. German radio broadcasts claimed that a miracle had saved the fatherland from invasion. The reality was far different. By the time of the bridge's collapse, the Americans had established a substantial bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine. 5 divisions had crossed via the Ludendorff Bridge, and the pontoon bridges constructed alongside it. The collapse, while tragic for those involved, had minimal strategic impact on the Allied advance. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, recognized this when informed of the bridge's failure. "Get me the casualty figures," was his first question, showing more concern for the men than the structure. The bridge that had defied repeated Allied bombing raids survived a demolition attempt and withstood 10 days of desperate German attacks, had finally succumbed to the cumulative stress of battle damage and overuse. For the men of the 276th and 1058th Engineer Battalions, March 17, 1945, would be remembered as a day of tragedy. But for the broader war effort, it was merely a footnote. The Rhine had been crossed. The pathway into Germany's heartland lay open. As for the German officers executed for failing to destroy the bridge, their deaths had been in vain. The bridge's ultimate collapse came too late to change the war's outcome. In the gathering darkness of March 17, as recovery teams continued to search the Rhine for missing engineers, the twisted remains of the Ludendorff Bridge jutted from the water like the skeleton of some prehistoric monster, a monument to both human achievement and the terrible cost of war. April 15, 1945. Remagen, Germany. The ruins of the Ludendorff Bridge lay half-submerged in the Rhine, a tangle of twisted steel that would remain there for years after the war. The river flowed around and through the wreckage, gradually wearing away at the man-made intrusion into its ancient course. On the eastern bank, American forces had long since broken out of the Remagen bridgehead. The crossing that had begun with Sergeant Alexander Drabik's dash across the bridge on March 7 had expanded into a major offensive that helped encircle Germany's industrial Ruhr region. Field Marshal Walter Model, the commander who had failed to prevent the Americans from crossing the Rhine at Remagen, committed suicide on April 21, 1945, in the Ruhr pocket. Rather than surrender, he walked into the woods near Duisburg and shot himself. Adolf Hitler would follow suit 9 days later in his Berlin bunker, as Soviet forces closed in on the Nazi capital. For the men directly involved in the Remagen bridge drama, the aftermath took various forms. Sergeant Alexander Drabik received the Distinguished Service Cross for his courageous dash across the bridge. After the war, he returned to his job as a butcher in Toledo, Ohio. He would be killed in an automobile accident in 1993, at age 82, while en route to a reunion of his old unit. In a final irony, the man who had survived machine gun fire on the Ludendorff Bridge died on an American highway. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, the first American officer to cross the Rhine, received the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, and was given a battlefield promotion to captain. After the war, he remained in the Army and served in Korea, where he earned a Bronze Star. He died of cancer in 1951 at the age of 29, a tragically short life for a man who had made history. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the German engineer who had tried and failed to destroy the bridge, survived the war as an American prisoner. After his release, he testified at the Nuremberg trials about the events at Remagen. He would later tell author Ken Heckler that Timmerman and Drabik deserved their medals and then some. They saw us trying to blow that bridge, and by all odds it should have blown up while they were crossing it. Captain Willy Bratka, sentenced to death in absentia for his role in losing the bridge, also survived as a prisoner of war. After his release, he returned to Germany and lived a quiet life, rarely speaking about his wartime experiences. The families of the executed German officers, Major Hans Scheller, Major Herbert Strobel, Major August Kraft, and Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, had their military pensions revoked by the Nazi regime. These were later reinstated by the post-war German government. In 1966, a German court in Koblenz reviewed the death sentences passed by Hübner's flying court-martial and issued posthumous acquittals, declaring the proceedings legally invalid. Major General Rudolf Hübner, who had presided over the executions, was tried by a German court after the war and sentenced to 4 years in prison for his role in the Remagen executions. He died in 1965, unrepentant to the end. The 28 American engineers who died in the bridge collapse were buried with military honors. Their sacrifice, like that of so many others, helped purchase victory in Europe. Military historians continue to debate the strategic significance of the Remagen Bridge capture. General Dwight D. Eisenhower called it worth its weight in gold and stated that it shortened the war in Europe. Others argue that the main Rhine crossings were already planned and would have succeeded regardless of the Remagen operation. What is beyond dispute is the human drama that unfolded on and around that steel and stone structure in March 1945. A drama of courage, failure, sacrifice, and the terrible machinery of war and retribution. October 31, 2025, Remagen, Germany. The stone towers of the Ludendorff Bridge still stand on both banks of the Rhine, silent sentinels to history. The bridge itself was never rebuilt after the war. In its place, passenger ferries now transport tourists and locals between Remagen and Erpel. The western towers house the Peace Museum Bridge at Remagen, Friedensmuseum Brücke von Remagen, established in 1980. Here, visitors can learn the story of the bridge and its role in the final months of World War II. According to museum curator Klaus Schaefer, strange phenomena have been reported in and around the towers since the war's end. Visitors sometimes report hearing whispers in Russian from the stone walls, Schaefer explains. Others claim to see shadowy figures on the former bridge path after sunset, figures in American and German uniforms that vanish when approached. Most frequently reported is the spectral sound of metal twisting and groaning, followed by splashes, an auditory recreation of the bridge's final collapse, most often heard on March 17th, the anniversary of the disaster. Local fishermen avoid the area where the bridge once stood. Some claim to have seen faces looking up at them from beneath the river's surface, the lost engineers who were never recovered from the Rhine. I don't promote these stories officially, Schaefer admits. The museum is about history and peace education, but I've experienced things myself that I cannot explain. Schaefer recounts staying late in the museum one March evening and hearing what sounded like boots on metal, the distinctive sound of soldiers running across the bridge that no longer exists. Whether these tales represent supernatural phenomena or the power of imagination infused with historical knowledge, they speak to the enduring impact of the events at Remagen. The bridge may be gone, the war long over, but something remains, an echo of those fateful days in March 1945, when history pivoted on the fate of an aging railway bridge, and men on both sides found themselves caught in currents of history as powerful and unforgiving as the Rhine itself. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen stands as one of history's pivotal moments, a nexus where individual decisions and actions intersected with the vast machinery of war to create an unexpected outcome. It is a story without heroes or villains in the traditional sense. The German officers who failed to destroy the bridge were not traitors. They were men caught in an impossible situation, created by contradictory orders and inadequate resources. Their execution was not justice, but the spasm of a dying regime turning on its own. The American soldiers who captured the bridge were not superhuman. They were ordinary men who saw an opportunity and seized it, displaying the adaptability and initiative that characterized the U.S. Army at its best. The engineers who died when the bridge collapsed were neither victors nor vanquished. They were men doing their duty, caught in the final death throes of a structure that had absorbed more punishment than any bridge should bear. In the grand strategic calculus of World War II, the Remagen Bridge incident may have shortened the conflict by weeks or months. But in human terms, it remains a testament to both the courage of individuals and the impersonal cruelty of war, where success or failure, life or death, often hinge on factors beyond anyone's control. The Rhine continues to flow beneath where the bridge once stood, as it has for millennia before the brief human drama of March 1945, and will for millennia after. The river, at least, is indifferent to the blood that has been shed in and around its waters. But we who come after cannot afford such indifference. The Ludendorff Bridge is gone, but its story remains. A powerful reminder that history is made not just by the grand designs of generals and statesmen, but by the actions of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. In that respect, the bridge at Remagen still stands in memory, a crossing point between past and present, between the horror of war and the hope for peace. Thank you for listening. If you are also proud of the bravery of our soldiers, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new historical stories.